In this video, I'm going to show you how to install this leveling kit on the front of this F-150. Let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. You would want to use a 21mm socket. If your lug nuts are swollen like mine, because underneath the chrome cap it rusted, you would want to use a 22. And remove the wheel. Now with the wheel off from the back side, you can see the caliper that we have to remove. There's also a vacuum hose here for the hub actuator. I'm going to want to pull that off the hub, so let's do that now. We need to get as much stuff out as possible to have room to bring the knuckle forward so we can get this axle out. If you have to, you can use a screwdriver, a pry bar, to help pry this up and off, just like that. Then with a 10mm socket, remove the retainer bolt for the bracket that holds the brake hose on. Pull this out of the knuckle and set it aside, and unclip the ABS wire from this. Let's also unbolt the ABS wire from the knuckle with an 8mm socket. If it feels like it's going to break, work it back and forth because you don't want this breaking inside the knuckle. I've already done this, but I'm going to spray it again with a bunch of rust penetrant. Hopefully that'll work its way in there and help me loosen this up a little bit easier and without breaking it. There it is. Pull this off. Follow the ABS wire up and unclip it from where it's secured onto the frame. Just like this. Follow it up even more. It's clipped right here next to the control arm. Remove it from this retainer as well. I'm going to follow the ABS sensor all the way up here on the fender liner and unplug it. There's a clip on the back side. Press it and slide it out of its connector. Okay, just pop it out. Oh, there we go. That's why it's not coming out. A lot of times these get pretty full of debris here. Now you can pull the wire down. Now have a bungee cord ready so you can tie the caliper and bracket assembly out of the way. We're taking off the whole thing as a unit. Take this 18mm bolt out, as well as this one down here. Those will take off the caliper bracket off of the knuckle directly. With one off, leave it on a few threads so that you can have the caliper supported while you take off the other one. Now take both off. Pull it off of the rotor. Remove your rotor. If yours is stuck on because of rust, mine's not because it's new. But if it is and you're reusing it, then tap between the lug studs. That should break it free off the hub, but just make sure you don't damage the studs. Now we have to get this cap off that hides the axle nut. So take a screwdriver or a pry bar, tap it in here. There we go. Now you should be able to just pry it off of here. Then take a 13mm socket and let's remove the axle nut. At this point, you want to make sure the axle pushes through, which it does, so that's perfect. Next, I want to unbolt the outer tie rod stud off of the knuckle. To do that, you can use a 21mm socket. Now take a hammer and tap the knuckle right here so the tie rod stud can break free. There we go. Remove the tie rod from the knuckle. Now let's disconnect the upper ball joint from the knuckle also so we can tilt the knuckle forward. Use a 21mm socket. Put the nut back on a few threads to hold the knuckle as you break this free. And just like we did for the tie rod, hit the knuckle right here and it should pop off. There we go. Pry the control arm down, take the nut off, pull this up, and the knuckle will come forward. Now get the knuckle off of that upper ball joint, pull it forward, and there you go. Use a 30mm socket on the nut side and a 27 on the bolt side to hold it. Break this nut free. They're very tight, just as a little disclaimer. Take that off and make sure the bolt spins. If it doesn't, it's most likely seized inside the bushing there. So spray some rust penetrant and try to twist it back and forth. Fortunately for us, this one is not seized. Take a hammer, hammer the bolt out. Take it out the other side. At this point, let's take a pry bar, pry the control arm down and the strut out The control arm might not want to go down all the way because the sway bar is still attached, but that's okay, at least this broke free. Now to get more swing out of the lower control arm, I'm going to disconnect the top of the sway bar link here, use an 18mm socket, and we might not be able to take the nut off all the way with this, but I'm going to try it out. If it doesn't work, we'll hold this with pliers or a wrench and then use a wrench on this. At this point, the nut actually came up more than I expected, and because there's a large washer here, this allows us to put some locking pliers on without damaging the boot. Lock these on tight and finish removing the nut. This will hold the stud from spinning. There we go. If that doesn't work for you, just try to work it back and forth with rust penetrant. Eventually, it will come off. Take these off, and now we can swing this lower control arm down even more. I'm going to bring this axle back over the sway bar so it can be held here. If you need to tie it with a bungee cord, go ahead and do that. You just don't want it to swing down too far. Pry the shock up, or the strut, and the control arm down. Okay, there we go. Now the strut is free, so let's unbolt it off the top. At the top of the strut tower here, you'll see 3 15mm nuts that look like this. There's one here, and one in the back that is a little bit harder to see, but you can reach it. Just go over these lines and hoses. Take your 15mm socket. Sometimes you'll have to hammer it on here just because of rust buildup. And they are fairly tight, so make sure you have a long ratchet or a breaker bar of some sort. Try to break these free. There we go. This one, I'm going to back off a few threads, but I'm going to leave it on. I want to leave this one on for last because I want it to be accessible when the strut comes down, so I can leave this connected without it falling off, and then I'll unthread it the rest of the way when I'm ready to remove it. Move on to the second one. Take this one all the way off. And the one in the back you'll need a deep socket for, unless you want to pop these lines off. They just have a connector here, but I'm going to leave them on. Just put my socket over, break it free. Okay, this one's off, so this is the only thing holding the strut in at this point. I'll leave it on like this. Okay, once you pry it out, remove the last mounting nut. And now you can pull the strut right down and out, and there it is. Now to install your leveling kit, you want to put on the strut the side that does not have the exposed threads like this. So right here, this side bolts onto the top of the strut tower. This side, with the flat areas without threads, goes onto the strut itself. And fortunately, you can only put this on one way. So if it doesn't fit, just keep spinning it until it lines up perfectly. At this point, hold it on, and we'll have to start these mounting nuts in. These are the nuts that actually hold the strut into the vehicle. You reuse those or you use new ones. I'm going to snug one, not going to fully tighten it yet. I need this to move around still so I can start the other ones and line them up. Our leveling kit came with brand new hardware, so I'm going to use new mounting nuts. Okay, this one's lined up. Let's snug them, and then these get torqued to 30 foot-pounds, just like the factory hardware up on the truck. I have this spacer gently clamped in my vise so it can stop spinning. You have to torque this before you install it in the vehicle because, of course, once you install it, the strut tower is here and covers up these bolts. Like I said, 30 foot-pounds. Okay, now we can install the strut with the spacer in the vehicle. I have the other side spacer here, which I haven't put in yet, but I just wanted to show you the new hardware that is provided. You'll have bolts that go in from the top. Imagine that the vehicle's strut tower goes here, and you'll have to thread the bolts down into it and into the leveling kit. It comes with washers as well. You have a lock washer and a flat washer. You want to put the lock washer on the bolt first. This will grab the bolt and prevent it from spinning. And then the flat washer is here just to take up more of an area, a surface area, to provide a better clamping area for the bolt. Now let's get the strut in. Try to line up the best you can. It's going to be somewhat difficult to find the threads on this because you can't see it. Okay, this one's started. Bring it down as much as you can by hand. Now you can let go of it. Let's start the other two in. Okay, there's the second one. Bring this one up a little bit more. Okay, wiggle it around until you get that last one started. And with that started, on these bolts, you want to use an 8mm Allen head to tighten them up. We'll bottom them out and make sure that it's mostly lined up with the control arm here. It does have some adjustment to it, as you can see, so just make sure it's as lined up as possible, and then we'll torque these with the weight of the suspension on the strut. I have a pole jack underneath the lower control arm so I can raise this up. I'm not going to be able to just lift it up by myself. So I'm going to put upwards pressure on it. As I do that, make sure that the sway bar link goes in through the sway bar. Otherwise, if it doesn't, it stays like this. You'll have a lot of trouble getting it in once the control arm is up. Also, the lower part of the strut is in the control arm, but it's not lined up yet. So as the control arm goes up, just make sure it lines up with the bolt hole. Okay. Pry this whichever way necessary to line it up. My bolt hole is very close to being lined up, so I'm going to go up a little more, get this lined up with that hole. I'm going to hold my pry bar here. I have my bolt ready, stick it through. I'm just going to take my socket with a breaker bar so I have some leverage and use that to basically pivot the bolt. Sway bar link is still lined up and on track to going in through the sway bar. So I'm going to raise this up a little bit more. With pressure still upwards on this control arm, I want to get this as close as possible to ride height so I can tighten this bushing without putting it in a bind when the truck is sitting on the ground on its own wheels. So put the nut on, let's snug it up, and the torque for this is actually 406 foot-pounds. But what I'm going to do, because I don't have a torque wrench that goes that high, is I'm just going to use my air gun and make it nice and tight. Hold it in place and tighten it up. There you have it. At this point, you're going to want to do the same to the other side, because if the other side does not have the leveling kit on, you will not be able to press the sway bar down. It's at a different height. Take a pry bar and pry the sway bar down onto the sway bar link, just like that. Put the mounting nut back on, and let's tighten it up. 59 foot-pounds is the torque for this. There we go. Now that we have the lower control arm supported and pressure is applied to this, let's torque these to 30 foot-pounds, which is the factory torque specs if you had your regular mounting nuts over here. That's one. Two. And three. There you go. At this point, I want to bring the knuckle up, make sure the axle actually slides through here. As you bring the knuckle up, make sure the upper ball joint on the control arm lines up. Looks like I'll need a pry bar to pry this down enough. Have the upper ball joint nut ready, Stick the pry bar in between the spring here. Okay, once you get it close enough, put the nut on, take your 21mm socket, pry down on the ball joint, and snug this up. The torque for this is 85 foot-pounds. The knuckle will spin because the tie rod's not connected yet, but once it bottoms out, you'll be able to torque it. That's 85 right there. Plug in the vacuum hose for the hub actuator. Make sure it's bottomed out completely. Let's get the tie rod stud back in. Press it down all the way into the knuckle, put the nut on, and we'll torque this to 85 foot-pounds. Put the axle nut on. We'll torque this to 20 foot-pounds after we bottom it out. It's easy to hold the hub at such a low torque. If you can't, just put a pry bar in between. Make sure it's on the flat side so it doesn't damage the threads, and hold the hub from spinning by the pry bar. Put this cap back on. I like to put some grease around the ring here. If you want to put RTV, you can. Tap it in with a rubber mallet. Make sure it's nicely seated. I have a new hub here. If you still have your old one, go ahead and clean it up so that these two ridges right here are nice and smooth. There's no buildup, no rust, no debris on them. And then we'll go ahead and coat them with anti-seize. And I will do that regardless of whether it's a new or an old hub. I also have a new rotor. If you don't have a new rotor, make sure the backside is clean like this one. Sand it down if necessary. Make sure you don't take off too much material though. And then slide it on. It's important that these two sit perfectly flat up against each other. And to secure this, I'm going to use a lug nut to clamp it on. You don't have to make this very tight. Just put it on here by hand so it can hold the rotor and prevent it from falling off. If it falls off and rust gets behind here, it'll sit crooked once it finally gets tightened down. Then you'll have some issues driving down the road, especially at higher speeds. Now let's get the caliper over the rotor, slide it on, start in the two caliper bolts, bottom these out, and then torque them. The torque for these two is 136 foot-pounds. Let's get these reconnected, these brackets here. I'll start with the brake hose, put this back on. This is the 10mm bolt that held it into the knuckle. Nice and snug, about 1/8 of a turn after it's bottomed out. Start the ABS wire in. Okay, bottom that out, make sure it's snug. Over here, clip this into the brake hose retainer. Follow the ABS wire and clip this into this bracket over here. Run it behind this brake line. There was one more retainer for it. That has to clip in right over here next to the vacuum hose. And the last part is to plug it in. Make sure that clicks and secure the connector onto the fender liner right there. Let's get the wheel on. Start on all 6 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 150 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. There you have it. Take it for a road test. After finishing this repair, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.